Hello, and welcome to session 10 of Moms on the Money Trail. My name is Katrina Boyer. I'm the Investor Education Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, and I am thrilled that you have joined us for the last session of our program. And I want to congratulate you for your dedication to completing this program. We have covered many different topics from creating a spending plan and a spending log all the way to how can we avoid investment fraud. So we're going to recap today. We're going to talk about the things that we learned. We're going to have some discussions, and I'm going to encourage you to keep up the good work. You've learned a lot and you've been provided with many resources. I want to encourage you to take what you've learned, take advantage of the resources that have been provided so that you can be on your way to financial success. So now that we've been through the past 9 sessions, I hope that you have a different vision for your financial future. So often we get stuck in the rut that says that I can't afford to do these things. I can't do these things because I am limited. I don't know what it looks like to think about putting money away for my child's education. There's so many things that we don't always understand. I hope that you have had your eyes open when it comes to understanding your financial future and the small changes that you can make in order to make a big impact on what you're doing. So, in session 1, we talked about and learned what it would cost to raise a child in 2024 and 2025. And I think all of us were really surprised at how much that total really is, especially when we consider that it did not include higher education. But during session 1, we also talked about how small changes could bring big results over time. So we talked about saving our change. We talked about maybe asking for lower rates. We talked about shopping for services. We talked about ways that you might be able to think about trying to save money going forward. And we learned about spending plans, and we learned some of the expenses that we really do have to be aware of. So we talked about how housing is a big part of our monthly budget, as well as what it will cost to raise those children, again, in the year that they're born, going forward until they turn 18. So we learned about utilities and food and transportation. And again, we learned that education was not included. But I gave you a glimpse of hope when we started talking about the power of compound interest. And we learned that by putting away a few dollars here and there, we could actually start to see ourselves investing and perhaps having great long-term potential for investing and helping us to reach our long-term goals. During session 2, we talked about spending plans and spending logs. We talked about the importance of having a savings account, as well as setting some of those long-term goals. And I introduced some of the basics of investing. But we focused on sort of changing the way we think about money. We talked about forgetting some of our old money habits and how to make small changes on a regular basis. And we talked about creating a vision board and learning more information. And we really focused on how we can change the way we think so that we can change our financial future as we move forward. And I shared with you how I was able to stop spending $1 bills for a total of 1 year. I put them in a box, and eventually, after just a couple months, I had about $75. I took that $75 and I opened a savings account. And after 12 months, I had saved $500. and I was able to take my kids for a long weekend to the shore. That was something that was really special to myself and my kids because it was the first time we had ever really been able to do something like that we had planned long term and we were able to pay cash for it. So I want to take a moment and just have you sort of tell me about some changes that you made in the way that you thought about money since we had that session, and what changes did you make, or what changes are you planning to make? So we'll pause now so that we can have that conversation. Okay, let's move on. In session 3, we talked about credit reports and scores and the importance of making sure that the reports are accurate. We learned that your credit score is kind of like a report card, um, but the credit report itself is where that score comes from. So as long as our credit report is accurate, the score is what it is. And we kind of linked that towards school and how your grade is what it is based upon what you've done in class. So your credit report is your what you've done in class, and your score is the grade that you have for the work that you've done. And we learned about annualcreditreport.com and how important it is for us to check our credit. And so I want you to pause here and let me know if you've pulled your credit. And if you have, what exactly surprised you, or what did you learn from that? All right. So we also learned that if there's something not right on our credit report, we can report that to each of the 3 credit reporting bureaus. And we talked about how important that is because some of those small errors on our credit report can actually have a pretty big impact on the work that we do, as far as our credit report. So I want to make sure that we want to make sure that if it's not accurate, we report it and then take the steps that we need to take if by chance we've been victims of identity theft or there's credit that doesn't belong to us. And then in session 4, we moved on and we started to talk about our big purchase. We talked about buying a house or a car. And we talked about the importance of ensuring that you can actually afford the new payment. So often I hear from people who tell me, Katrina, I bought this great house, but now I can't afford to pay the utilities because my mortgage payment is so high. Or I didn't think about the fact that I might have to replace the roof on my new house, or the hot water heater might go. And so we talked about the importance of ensuring that not only do we have the money to pay the bill, make the mortgage payment or the car payment, we also needed to plan for the unexpected. And that's where we talked about having that emergency fund and the importance of even just having a few $100s set aside so that in the event we have an emergency, maybe you have a flat tire, maybe the car you bought needs a new battery. My son recently bought a new vehicle and he had to put in a new alternator. Well, that was a couple $100s that he hadn't planned to spend. And so that created a financial hardship. If he had had an emergency fund, he could have taken care of that without causing himself a whole lot of undue stress. So that's what we mean when we talk about making sure that we plan for the unexpected. Eventually, you might want to have a goal where you have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses saved, but setting aside a few $100s is a great first step. And so I encourage you, when we talked about that at the time, we talked about trying to make those things happen. In session 5, we learned about insurance, and we heard from Bethany from the Pennsylvania Department of Insurance. And we learned that what we don't know about insurance can end up being a big financial problem. And the insurance department provided us some really great resources at insurance.pa.gov, and their consumer services number there, 877-881-6388. And they're on social media at PA Insurance Department, and on Facebook also at PA Insurance Department. We have a lot of great resources there, and I encourage you to follow the Department of Insurance there. During session 6, we talked about banking in the 21st century, and we talked about the differences between online banking from a brick and mortar financial institution and having an account with a strictly virtual institution. We talked about the pros and cons that we need to be aware of, and the things that we needed to consider if we're going to open a virtual account. So we talked about how with a virtual bank, there's no brick and mortar financial institution that you can walk into. So you have to rely on calling or sending emails. And that's okay if that's what you're comfortable with. But it's important that we recognize what we are comfortable with as consumers. And then we wrapped it up with talking about the things that we need to remember no matter what kind of institution we choose. And that things like making sure that we have the proper overdraft protection, making sure that we know what minimum balances are and what it costs if we do have an overdraft, or what we can expect from the financial institution when we make a deposit that we don't normally make. Those types of things are things that we have to remember and consider when we're looking at the financial institution that we're going to have a relationship with. Throughout the program, we learned about the Office of Consumer Services at my office, the Department of Banking and Securities, and how our staff are available to answer questions regarding your financial transactions, whether you maybe have become a victim of a fraud or a scam, or you have a question about one of the entities that we regulate. So I provided you with that resource throughout our program. We also talked about how financial institutions can be regulated by the federal government or the state government. My office regulates those that are regulated by the state, but banks and savings institutions can go to helpwithmybank.gov should they have questions, and credit unions can go to ncua.gov, which stands for National Credit Union Administration. And both of their telephone numbers are provided for your benefit here. We provided some other federal resources. We talked about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at consumerfinance.gov. We talked about FDIC insurance, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures banks. It insures consumers the accounts that they have at a financial institution should that bank fail. We talked about how it doesn't cover overdrafts or things of that nature. We talked about how FDIC insurance is very specific to certain scenarios. And then we talked about the Federal Reserve Bank and how we can learn more about finance at federalreserveconsumerhealth.gov, especially if we have questions about our financial institutions and our transactions with those institutions. And then we promptly moved into session 7, where we talked about investment accounts and the 4 different categories that we can have those accounts. So we talked about wealth building accounts, where we're just simply investing money, we're putting money into the account so that we can grow wealth. We talked about retirement accounts like 401ks. We talked about IRAs. We talked about spousal IRAs. And then we talked about the employer-sponsored retirements. Again, that 401k, the 403b. And then finally, we talked about education accounts, and we had a guest speaker from Pennsylvania Treasury who told you all about some of the programs that they offer. But I want to take a break. And I want to ask you, if someone gave you $500 out of the blue, and they told you that you had to put it into one of the investment types that we talked about, I'm curious which one you would choose and why would you choose that? So we will discuss that. And then, like I said, we learned that higher education is getting more and more expensive. You can see here on the graph that in 2020, you can see what the expenses were and what they're expected to be in 2040 and 2041. The cost of higher education is growing. And so we learned about Pennsylvania Department of Treasury's savings programs. We learned about the Keystone Scholars, where the state deposited $100 into every child's, they created an account for every newborn baby, and $100 is automatically put into that account for each child that's born in Pennsylvania. And then they talked about how you could open other accounts through the PA 529 program to help you save for your child's higher education. And then we talked a little bit about the PA ABLE program, which allows for savings accounts for individuals who have disabilities. And we talked about the importance of them being able to save for their needs. And then we learned about broker check, and that's where we can go to learn about our investment professional. We can make sure that the broker dealer or the financial advisor that we're considering hiring is properly registered. We learn that we can get information about their history, about if they've had complaints or if they've had actions taken against them in Pennsylvania or another jurisdiction. And then we talked about how to verify an investment offering, and we learned about the Securities and Exchange Commission's EDGAR database. And we learned that we can check the history of registered investments. We could learn all about what those things look like from a reputable source. Then we talked about the Securities and Exchange Commission's website, investor.gov, where we can learn more about saving and investing, because the truth is we could talk about investment strategies and ways to reach our investment goals all day, every day, and not cover it all. So we provided those resources at investor.gov and investright.org. Both of those are reputable websites that you can use to learn more about investing. Then in session 8, we talked about how to choose the account professional that's right for you. Pennsylvania has more than 200,000 investment professionals registered right here in the Commonwealth. So we talked about how do we make sure that the one that we decide to work with is right for us. And we learned that brokerage accounts is a place where we can put money so that we can buy and sell stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. And we learned about how we can start to open those accounts, again, so we can plan for our long-term financial goals. And we talked about the things that we need to consider when we're thinking about hiring a professional. We talked about how we want to know how they're going to be paid. What's their fee structure like? We learned an awful lot about the client relationship summary. And we learned that we should ask questions of any investment professional that we're considering. And then we talked about what type of account is right for you. Are you looking to build wealth? Are you looking to manage your own portfolio? Do you want to do the research into the stocks that you want to purchase? We talked about robo advisors and how we can fill out a survey and they will help us to reach with the algorithms, it's sort of a set it and forget it kind of scenario. And then we talked about managed accounts where someone that we work with closely manages all aspects of our portfolio, and they may actually help us reach our other financial goals and our long-term goals as well. So then we had the question, which type of account was right for you? And I want to take a pause here so that you can think about the different types of accounts that we talked about, and we can have that conversation. In session 9, we learned all about investment frauds and how we can avoid them. We talked about Ponzi schemes and how there's no real business. Eventually, we run out of investors and the whole thing comes crashing down. We talked specifically about a couple of different cases, one that was here in Pennsylvania. Then we talked about the free lunch option and the free dinner options, and there was a conversation about what that can look like and how there may not be any sales pressure at dinner, but shortly after you leave dinner, you start to receive those solicitation calls. And we talked about how easy it can be to get sucked into the hype of the promise that that individual is selling. And we talked about the importance of using the skills that we have, learning about the investment professional and learning about the investment being offered and how it's important to be able to do those things. We talked about affinity fraud and how people come into our organizations and they pretend to have things in common with us, and then they convince us to invest our hard-earned money. We talked about pump and dump scams where somebody claims that a big thing is going to happen, knowing that their goal is to drive the price of a specific stock really, really high. And then their plan is to sell and make a huge profit. But the reality is that thing that they told you was going to happen was never going to happen. And when that person or those individuals sell those stock, the value of the stock crashes again. We talked about promissory notes and how there are legitimate promissory notes, but there are certain circumstances where you can buy those promissory notes. And we talked about how you have to be a sophisticated investor, which is that person who has more than $1 million worth of assets being managed by a firm and at least $200,000 in annual income. But we talked about how promissory note scams promise us a really high return on our investment in a short amount of time. So a promissory note scam might be for 9 or 10 months, and they promise us a 15 or 20% return on our investment. And we talked about how even promissory notes have to be registered through the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we can learn about them on the Edgar database. And then finally, we talked about impersonator fraud, and that's where somebody actually pretends to be a legitimate investment advisor or belonging to being part of a legitimate investment firm. And we talked about some of the things that we can do to ensure that we're actually working with who we think we are instead of an impersonator. We talked about the importance of verifying the website is accurate, because impersonator scams are going to copy and paste and make things look exactly like the real thing, but they're actually counterfeit. And so we talked about what that can look like. So I'm curious, which of the frauds or scams that we talked about were you already aware of, and which one of them surprised you? We also talked about the importance of speaking up. Two of the investment frauds that I talked about specifically had cases right here in Pennsylvania where the scam artists were caught and prosecuted and convicted. And we talked about how if someone doesn't report that to regulators or law enforcement, there's nothing that can be done because if we don't know what we don't know. So we talked about the importance of reporting investment fraud to my office at dobs.pa.gov or the Securities and Exchange Commission at sec.gov/TCR. And we provided the 800 numbers for you to call if you wanted to do it, file your complaint that way, or try to get more information and learn about whether or not you have been a victim of an investment fraud or scam. And here we are in session 10, and I'm so excited for you as you continue your journey into financial literacy and reaching your long-term goals. And I'm curious, which of the sessions that we did, I recapped all 10 very quickly, which of those 10 was your favorite? And which of the 10 was your least favorite? And I'd love to hear why that is. If you're participating in the recorded session, all of these questions are outlined on your quiz, and you are required to answer all 5 of those questions. So I would encourage you to take a look at the quiz. Remember, in order to get credit for participation, you have to submit that quiz. Some of your organizations are offering some form of incentive, but you have to complete all 10 sessions. So make sure that you have done that. If you're not sure, you can always email me at the email address that you see here. I want to thank you for your time tonight, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Take care.